of my message for many of you who are Lord of the Rings fans is the Return of the King. Okay, in this day and age, it's become quite commonplace for movie directors, for writers, to release a movie in a multi-part sequel, maybe trilogy, quadrilogy. In fact, there is a particular book that I was following, a series that I was following quite closely. It took 13 volumes to finish, and it took so long to finish, the author actually died before he could finish it, and somebody else had to complete it for him. Okay? Imagine this. Now you are a fan of Lord of the Rings. You see the first movie, you are excited, you're really eager to see the second one, and it takes 2 years before the second one comes out. What would that do to you? How would you feel about it? Okay, expectation, maybe a little bit of frustration, and what's wrong with these directors? Why are they taking so long to release this movie? Okay? Now think about this. Not 2 years, it takes 10 years for the second one to come out. What would that do to you? Typically, the anticipation turns into frustration and eventually indifference. Because in our life is so busy, things are happening so fast, it is very hard for us to maintain interest in anything that takes too long. We want it right now, tomorrow, and if something takes too long, we eventually lose interest in it, right? We become indifferent to it. What happens if Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, the last one, you're eagerly waiting for it, you're waiting to see how the story will conclude, takes 30 years before the sequel is released, okay? Now, amazingly, these kinds of similar thoughts and frustrations were exactly the ones plaguing the readers of the Gospel of Matthew. When Matthew wrote his Gospel to his original audience, that's exactly what they were going through, frustration, questions about the return of the King. Now, the first part of this two-part sequel, what we call the first coming, was amazing. Jesus came. He healed many people. He taught much. He died. He rose again. And he promised them that he will be back soon. And they were all eagerly waiting that he will come tomorrow. He will come next week. He will come this year. He'll come 2 years from now. And soon it is 30 years after the death of Jesus, and he is still not here. And they start to wonder, is he even the Messiah? Is he even coming back? And the question, this particular question, is he the one, takes significance, especially in face of intense persecution, though sporadic, intense persecution that the church was facing. You don't know whether you will be alive tomorrow. You don't know if you will see one more day. In face of that persecution, people were asking, is this really worth it? Should I sacrifice my life for this Jesus, for this man who came and called himself the Messiah? Is it even worth it? Those are the questions that the readers were asking. And we may now, sitting here 2,000 years removed, where our life, we don't face any kind of persecution to practice our faith, we may sit here and wonder, that is foolish of them to ask this kind of question. That is a lack of faith. They are being apostates to ask these kinds of questions. Turn with me in your Bible to Matthew chapter 11, verses 1 to 6. I will not actually read those, but I will tell you what is going on in that passage. Matthew chapter 11. Okay? Just to show you that this question, the question where we ask, is he really the one? Is he really coming? Is Jesus really going to fulfill his promises that he has made? Is not so unusual, because here is John the Baptist, who is in prison in Matthew 11, and he sends his disciples to Jesus to ask the exact same question. Are you the one? Are you the expected one? Are you the promised one? I mean, John the Baptist, he is cousin of Jesus, probably heard all his life concerning who Jesus is and what he will do, baptized Jesus, saw the dove descend upon him, heard the voice from heaven declaring that Jesus is the one, and yet John the Baptist is in prison, probably facing the last few days of his life, and he is asking the question, are you the one? Should we be looking for someone else? Such questions become very significant when we are faced with critical situations in life. Okay, with that, the passage that I'm going to actually focus is not Matthew 11, but Matthew 25. Turn to Matthew 25, verses 1 to 13, and the parable of 10 virgins. That is really the focus of my sermon this morning. Okay, you might know from having read the gospel before or from having heard someone preach from this, you might know that this particular parable, the parable of 10 virgins, occurs in a text that we often call the Olivet Discourse. Discourse is just a technical word which means an extended amount of teaching, and the book of Matthew has 5 discourses. This particular one, the last one, Jesus is preaching or teaching to his disciples from the Mount of Olives, and hence the word the Olivet Discourse. So they are asking, his disciples, or the readers of Matthew are asking, and so are the disciples of Jesus asking, when is the second coming going to happen? What are the signs that precede it? How will we know that you are really coming? What happens? And so this discourse provides a roadmap for all the events that lead up to the return of Jesus. And also, if you read this, which will not take time, but I will let you know, if you read the text, you will realize that the time is not yet here for him to come back. That is how Jesus says. He says these are the birth pains. And so the time is not yet here. But Matthew spends most of his time in the Olivet Discourse. Almost 64% of the verses are spent not describing his second coming, not describing the signs that precede his second coming, but he will spend describing how we must live while we wait for Jesus to return. That is the bigger focus of the Olivet Discourse. We get caught up in setting dates and discovering, oh, is this the time or is that the time? We get caught up in all these, what will happen when, who will, when is the tribulation, when is this and when is that? But focus of Matthew in this particular discourse is not about all of that, but really how must we live? What must be our attitude as we wait for the second coming? Okay, Matthew 25, verse 1. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. Okay, it starts out with the word then. Then is a time indicator. It is connecting this particular passage to what happened before. And really what Matthew is saying is when the Son of Man comes a second time to establish his kingdom, it will be as it described in the following story in the parable of 10 virgins. It will happen as it is described in this parable. Okay, for us, in order to catch the impact of this story, we must know a little bit about the Eastern culture. In Eastern culture, often the bridegroom is the most important. It's not the bride. In Eastern culture, you may not know this, especially all of us who are from India, you may not know this. In the Eastern culture, in the Jewish culture, it is the groom who pays to the bride's father an amount of money called mohar. For the bride, for the right and the privilege to marry a woman, it is the groom who pays. Okay, in Indian culture, it's the other way around. It is the bride and bride's family who ends up paying. Not only do they give away their daughter, but they also have to pay. Right? In Jewish culture, that was not the case. A Jewish wedding had 3 parts to it. First, an engagement or a betrothal, which was almost always arranged by the parents of the family, of both families, because typically the groom and the bride tend to be of younger in age. Okay, after several months following this engagement, as long as sometimes a year, comes the time of the wedding. The ceremony itself begins with the groom and his friends and the wedding party approaching the house of the bride and escorting the bride who is fully decorated adorned, veiled, and wearing ceremonial clothes. She is then escorted by the groom and the wedding party back to the groom's house with much dancing and singing. As soon as the bride enters the groom's house, the wedding is considered complete. The wedding is then followed by a marriage feast, which may last as long as 1 week to 2 weeks. That's really how they did marriages in those days. Now, this is such a common story. Most of us can relate to this, especially even in the Indian weddings. They're full of color, full of singing and joy. Sometimes, as important as the wedding is, even the arrival of the groom is anticipated or is waited with great anticipation. Everybody will be looking for, when is the groom coming? Is he here yet? Is he arrived yet? How long? Why is it taking so long? When is he going to be here? In American weddings, at least the few that I have attended, it seems it's the arrival of the bride that is awaited eagerly. The groom just gets the side entrance. And once the bride walks through the front entrance, the doors are closed and no one is allowed in. Okay? But going back to the Jewish weddings, it is the groom who is at the center. Okay? I hear is something interesting. It's not that, think about a Jewish village. Maybe 1,000 people, maybe 500 people. They're not big towns, not big villages. It's not like they didn't know the groom. They've been engaged for a year. So everybody knew who was marrying whom. They were familiar with the groom. They knew who the groom was. It's not that he was a stranger. And that's why they were waiting so eagerly to meet. But yet, the anticipation of the wedding, the anticipation of meeting him, the anticipation of seeing the groom arrive is huge. And you can feel the excitement in the air and the young women eager to get going on their welcoming trip. Verse 2. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them. But the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. Here we are immediately, as we read these verses, we're given a sneak peek into how this story is going to end. Right? 5 are described as foolish, 5 are described as wise. And what was the reason? What distinguished the wise from the foolish? It's really to do with how they prepared for this meeting of the groom. The wise ones took with them some oil, and the foolish ones did not take any oil with them. Now, if you have ever seen these old-fashioned lamps or the torches that they use, these wick-based lamps, all of you are probably never seen one of these. You lived in their electric lights. You never have to worry about wick-based lamps. But if you had seen one, it is there's a container with oil and there's a wick that sits in this oil. And the wick, it's not the wick that actually burns, but it's the oil that moves up the wick through capillary action. Right? However, if the oil is gone, the wick will light up, but it will burn immediately and you will have no light shortly thereafter. Right? So it is very important to make sure that the wick is always immersed in the oil. Okay, the other kind of lamps they used was a torch. A torch is typically a stick with a cloth at the end that is dipped in the oil, not too much so that it's not dripping all over you, and then you light it. And again, it's the oil that burns and not the cloth itself. So without the oil, the lamp is useless, the torch is useless. It will burn away very, very quickly. Now, when you think about these women, these foolish women, as Matthew describes them, who did not prepare for the meeting of the groom, who did not take any oil with them, this is not too dissimilar from our life situations, isn't it? I was talking to my wife the other day, and I was asking her, how many times do you actually sat in a car, you turn the engine on, only to discover that there's no gas, and the red light is blinking at you? And you think, and you have to go to this meeting, you're already out of time, it's maybe an important interview, and you tell yourself, I'm never going to do this. Next time around, I will be so prepared, I will make sure everything is ready, everything is put where it is supposed to be so that I can grab, I make sure the oil is there in my car so that I never have to face this kind of tension. How about this? Some of us at work, we go to this meeting, very important meeting, and we grab the wrong USB stick. And you plug it in and only to discover, oops, file is missing. Or you open the file only to find out that it doesn't have those last minute changes that you did. You didn't save it. Okay? We always tell ourselves, next time I will not do this. Next time I will be better prepared. But what if there is no next time? What if opportunity knocks only once? Okay? That was the case here. Verses 5 to 7. As the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a cry, "Here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. Again, I do not know about a lot of weddings in other cultures, but in some parts of India, it is considered fashionable, in fact, it is expected that the groom will not arrive on time. Okay? In fact, it is considered an insult to the groom if he actually arrives in time for his own wedding. The longer it takes him to arrive, the more prestigious it is considered. Okay, it's weird, isn't it? But here also, we don't know, for some unknown reason, the author does not tell us. The groom is delayed. All of them, both the wise ones and the foolish ones, all of them get drowsy waiting for the groom to arrive, and they sleep. Okay, eventually somebody spots the groom coming down the road, and Matthew writes, by then it was midnight. It was late in the night. Okay. A cry is heard, "Here is the bridegroom, come out from the place where you are sleeping and meet him." And the first thing they all do is take out their lamps and trim them. Get their lamps ready to be lit. Verses 8 to 10. And the foolish one said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise answered, saying, "Since there will not be enough for us and for you, go rather to the dealers and buy for yourself." And while they were going to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. So what do the foolish women do? They trim the lamps and they realize, we don't have enough oil. If we light these lamps, the wicks will burn away, the cloth will burn away immediately, and we will have no light. And so they ask the wise ones, "Can you share some of your oil with us?" Okay? I mean, we teach our children to share, right? It's the right thing to do, we should share. But the wise ones say, I cannot share. Because if we were to share with you, our lamps may work for a short period of time, but eventually they all will go out, and it would be completely dishonorable to the groom to take him to the bride's place in darkness. Remember, this was midnight. So the wise women tell the foolish one, "Go get your own oil, go to the dealers, go find them and get your own oil." I thought it was strange. I mean, what dealer is open at midnight for you to go buy the oil? But maybe they were, I don't know. In any case, the foolish women go away. They are now in search of the oil. And the wise women light their lamps, escort the bride to the place he is going, the groom to the place he is going. And here is something interesting. Okay, as I told you, the way the weddings work, the wedding feast actually takes place in the groom's house. So the groom is on the way to pick up the bride. Then they escort her all the way back to his house, and wedding is done, completed as soon as she enters the house, and then they have the feast. Right? So which means by in the amount of time it took the foolish woman to go find the oil, all of these things are, this two-way trip is complete. He went, he picked up his bride, escorted her back to his house, the feast is on and the door is shut. Right? Maybe think about this. As I said, in a Jewish wedding, the groom is the most important individual. He is the most waited for celebrity. And therefore, it only makes sense that the door is shut as soon as the groom has entered the feast. It would be in their culture, and even in our culture today, let's talk about American wedding, and this is what I have seen. As soon as the bride comes in, they shut the doors. By then, you are supposed to be in the wedding, not waiting outside, not coming half an hour later, opening the doors and saying, "Tada, I'm here," right? Unfortunately, for us who come from the Indian context, this is somewhat of a strange thing. I mean, the wedding is going on, people come, people go, people do whatever they want. In fact, it's like there are two events that happen in an Indian wedding, right? The wedding will be going on the stage, but everybody else will be doing their own thing. Nobody pays attention to what is happening here, right? And so for us, we may find this strange, but that's not true. That is not the way it happens, even in Jewish weddings. I mean, we are sort of familiar with this, right? Even if not weddings. For example, you go to an airport, you go to board on a plane, you show them, I have the passport, I have the ticket, get me on the plane. But they say, sorry, the door is shut. You can't come in because you are not ready. You were not ready when the time was here. Okay, verses 11 to 13. Afterward, the other virgins come also saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. But he answered, truly I say to you, I do not know you. At this point of the story, the foolish virgins arrive at the house of the feast. We do not know if they were successful in their search for the oil, but it doesn't really matter because they had no one to accompany anymore. They say, Lord, Lord, please open the house, open the door to us. And he says, presumably the groom, he refuses to open the door and emphatically states that he will not open the door because he does not know them. Their failure to be ready for the occasion, their resulting absence when the groom arrived, has resulted in a severed connection between the groom and these young women. Now they are left outside of the wedding banquet itself. Turn to Luke chapter 13, verse 25. Luke 13:25. When once the master of and this is what Luke writes in Luke 13:25. When once the master of the house has risen and shut the door, and you begin to stand outside and to knock at the door, saying, Lord, open to us, then he will answer you, I do not know where you come from. Okay, so this is a passage that is this idea of a door being shut, this idea of people standing outside and the door not being opened even though you knock on it, ask for it to be opened, is not something that is only in this parable. It is repeated multiple times. Even in Matthew 7:23, he has the same thing. Many people knock on the door of heaven saying, Lord, open the door for us. We have done all of these things in your name. And Jesus' response is, go away, I do not know who you are. Go away. And lastly, verse 13 of the parable says, watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. So at last we come to the point of this parable. Watch and be ready, because you do not know neither the day nor the hour when King Jesus will return. Very easily, in the context of the Olivet Discourse and the wider context of Matthew and even the New Testament, it is somewhat obvious to us, or we can figure out who some of these figures in this parable are. Jesus often referred to himself as the groom. For example, in Matthew 9:15, or in the parable of the wedding banquet. The coming kingdom of heaven itself is described often in the Bible as a wedding feast. For example, in Matthew 8:11. Okay, we know that the church is always referred to as his bride. So clearly, we can see in the elements of this parable, in this story, that Matthew is talking about Jesus coming to claim his bride. And the question is the bride ready? Are the people for whom he is coming, are they ready to receive him? So this seems to be the message that Matthew has for his readers. Readers who are struggling with the reality of second coming and with the inauguration of his kingdom. The author's message is that while the second coming is currently delayed, will they be numbered among those who are found to be ready and waiting to receive the returning groom who's coming to claim his bride, the church. Okay, what does all of this mean to us? Okay, nice parable, interesting story. What does it mean to us? How does it actually apply to us? I mean, think about this. We too are in the same situation as Matthew's original readers. We too live in this time between the first coming and the second coming. In fact, more so than them, they were only 30 years removed from Jesus' first coming. We are removed by 2,000 years. So going back to think of this. Now the sequel, the third part of the Lord of the Rings, instead of 30 years, it has taken 2,000 years and it is still not here. Okay, indifference. Now you are completely indifferent. And unfortunately, that is true even of us today in the church. We have become indifferent to the idea of second coming because it has taken so long. We, not just the readers of Matthew who are only 30 years removed, we too ask the same question. Is he coming? Is he really the one? Even if we, maybe not in those words, we still wonder what difference does it actually make to us in our lives. So I did an informal survey on this topic. Both in my house and in the Bible study, I have asked several people. How many of us actually live our lives with an eye on the imminent return of Jesus? For how many of us, listen to this, for how many of us does the promise of his second coming actually make a difference in how we live today, in how we live tomorrow? Reflect on that for a moment. For you, as you go through your daily activities, as you get up tomorrow, Monday, go to work, do the things that you do, or some of you go to school and do the things that you do at school or at home, or whatever it is that you do come Monday, does it matter to you that Jesus is going to come back, that he will return few years, whenever he chooses to? Does it actually make a difference? Does it change how you live? Go back to the parable. Look at verse 10. How are the wise women described in verse 10? Help me out. How are they described in verse 10? As those who were ready. They were ready for the coming of the king, for the coming of the groom. They were ready and they were prepared to meet him. Okay, look at verse 12. Why were the foolish women denied entry into the feast? What was the reason that was provided? Because the groom did not know them. Okay, this creates an interesting dynamic between knowing someone and being ready for someone. Is it possible that there is some connection between their preparedness to meet the groom and their experiential knowledge of him? Now, okay, let us take an illustration from our own lives. Let's say one of the spouses is traveling. Okay, I don't travel as much, but there are some here who travel quite often, quite regularly. And wife or husband, they go out on a trip. And as one who is staying here, you are often thinking about them. You are thinking, what is he doing? What is she eating? Is he sleeping well? Taking care of himself? I hope they are being successful in all their work. And we're constantly thinking about them. Why? Because we know them. There is a relationship that exists. And because of that, we are all the time thinking about this spouse who's traveling and who's away from home. In fact, I know someone, let's say the date for their return comes, you clean up the house, you wash all the dishes, you wash the van, and you cook good, maybe even take some flowers, and you rush to the airport to meet the returning spouse. In fact, I know someone here who actually bought a brand new van with a bow tie and all to receive their wife when she came back from India. Okay? Why is there such great anticipation to receive someone that you know? Because we have a relationship. We have an abiding relationship. We have a deep relationship with them. Right? So there is this strong connection between knowing someone and being ready to meet someone. But if we are not excited about the return of Jesus, if his promise of second coming makes no difference for our lives, is it because we do not know him as we ought to know him? Is it because the gospel has not penetrated deep into our hearts as it ought to have? Please do not misunderstand me. When I say this is a reflection of my very own life. Even I struggle with the very same questions that I have asked you. How much does his promise of second coming actually make a difference in my life? Right? And if it does not, is it because I don't know as I ought to know? Thankfully, the gospel also reminds me that God accepts me not based on the strength of my love or the faithfulness of my obedience, but on the obedience of Christ and his faithfulness. Realizing that he, the bridegroom, came the first time to die for us, the bride, and that he will come again to claim us and take us to the wedding feast, that should build within us a great anticipation for that day. Life is hard with all kinds of challenges, work pressures, parenting pitfalls, relational disputes, health worries, school problems, an unending list of problems that we face each day. But we are so busy, so caught up in our problems, so busy solving our own issues, we say, I don't have time for this. I don't have time to think about this or that or something else. I don't have time. I'm so busy putting food on the table. I'm so busy getting through my next assignment. I'm so busy trying to find a job. I'm so busy doing this. We are too busy to think about second coming. But if you read Matthew, if you read the Bible, if you read the New Testament, over and over again, their message is this. It is when you think about the second coming, it is when you have your one eye focused on the cross and another eye focused on his coming. It is when life and the challenges that you face, you are able to cope with them. In fact, not only are you able to cope with them, you are able to thrive in the midst of them. It is the promise of the second coming that makes life livable, the challenges livable. Take, for example, injustice. We face injustice. Injustice at work, injustice in life, injustice from our friends, injustice in many different forms. Now, when you think about the cross, the greatest injustice was sacrificing someone who was not guilty for the guilt of the world. He took upon himself injustice so that we will be promised justice one day in heaven. All the rights will be wronged, all the tears will be wiped, all the problems that we faced in this life will be addressed one day because of the injustice that took place on the cross. Take suffering. How do we cope with suffering in this life? Only when we realize that Jesus suffered so that my suffering is dealt with one day in the future. In the context of this parable, readiness meant carrying extra oil while waiting for the groom to make his appearance. Readiness involves doing something and being prepared. In what way does Matthew... Now, just going back to the Gospel of Matthew, as I said very early on, he wrote this Gospel to answer the question, is Jesus the one? Is he coming back? When is he coming back? These were the questions his readers were asking, and so he writes this gospel to answer these questions. But he's not just interested in telling them, yes, Jesus is the one, proving that Jesus is indeed the Messiah. He's not interested in just that. He wants to actually tell his readers, he is coming, but while you wait for his coming, this is how you must live. And Matthew provides that instruction in his last command in Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 to 20. And this is what he says to his readers and then down through the ages to all of us. While you wait for his coming, this is how you ought to live. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. What are we called to do while we wait for Jesus to return? To be out there making disciples of all nations across all racial and cultural boundaries. And He promises His presence when we are engaged in that endeavor. So, when Jesus comes back, will He find us ready? What will He find us engaged in? What will He find us doing? At Spectrum Church, we are sold out to the idea of gospel-centered, multicultural discipleship. Everything we do has to be about this. The picnic yesterday was about this. Pastor JP has been talking about the One Cube Challenge for a while because we are about this discipleship, multicultural, gospel-centered discipleship. I find it, as I talk to many of you, and even when I look at my own life, I find this challenging. Because when I look back and reflect upon my last several years of my life here in this country, I've spent so much time in church and hanging out with friends at church that I hardly know anybody who are outside the church. Very few friends, and even those, it seems like we're moving further and further away because I'm so busy doing church. And I think we need to change that. As Spectrum Church, our desire is to leave you your weekends free, to leave you enough time so that you are out there in the community, building relationships, getting to know people, getting involved in their lives and letting them be part of your lives so that you have the opportunity to disciple them. Open your lives to them. Be part of their lives. There are people who are hungering, who are crying for God. And Matthew says, this is what you are called to do. Go and make disciples of all nations. What will Jesus find when He comes back? What will He see us doing? I will end with this quote from C.S. Lewis, from his essay, The World's Last Night. This is what C.S. Lewis writes: I do not find that pictures of physical catastrophe, that sign in the clouds, those heavens rolled up like a scroll, help one so much as the naked idea of judgment. We cannot always be excited, he writes. We can perhaps train ourselves to ask more and more often how the thing which we are saying or doing or failing to do at each moment will look when the irresistible light streams in upon it. That light which is so different than the light of this world, and yet even now we know just enough of it to take it into account. Now listen to this. Women sometimes have the problem of trying to judge by artificial light how a dress will look by daylight. That is very like the problem of all of us, to dress our souls not for the electric lights of the present world, but for the daylight of the next. The good dress is one that will face that light, for that light will last longer. How will our lives look under the illumination of that eternal light? Will Jesus find us ready when He comes back?